The number one question landing in my inbox this week is the same one I've been getting for 18 months. Only now it carries a different weight. If everything is supposedly falling into place, why does the chart still feel like it's holding its breath? Let me tell you what's actually happening, because it's not being explained to retail investors the way it should be. While most of the market has been staring at candles and arguing about short-term price action, 3 institutional events landed inside a single 72-hour window that, taken together, quietly closed the door on the regulatory uncertainty that has defined this asset for nearly a decade. The SEC didn't issue a press release about it. Bank of America didn't put it on the front page. Ripple didn't tweet it in capital letters. But the structure shifted, and the world, once again, missed the signal.
What I'm about to walk you through is the convergence pattern that the institutional desks are already pricing in, the mathematical reality that makes the next phase non-negotiable, and the specific window that is now closing faster than most holders realize. Let me pull back the curtain. Welcome back. I'm the analyst who reads the filings so you don't have to, and who refuses to traffic in hype when the data tells a quieter, sharper story. Today we decode the institutional convergence happening right now across regulators, banks, and infrastructure providers, and we examine what it actually means for anyone holding XRP through this phase. This is not financial advice. This is structural analysis. Let's get into it. Let's start with the hard truth. 95% of people in this market are watching the wrong screen. They're watching price. They should be watching plumbing. If you're wondering why an asset with the regulatory clarity, the institutional partnerships, and the technical infrastructure that XRP now possesses has not yet repriced to reflect its position, you need to understand something most retail investors have never had explained to them properly. The financial system does not reprice on news. It reprices on permission. And permission, in the regulated banking world, does not arrive in a single dramatic announcement. It arrives in layers. A charter here, a rulemaking notice there, a round table in a conference room in Washington, a piece of guidance from the OCC, a capital standard from the Federal Reserve. Each piece looks small on its own. Stitched together, they form the legal scaffolding that allows trillions of dollars of regulated capital to actually move. Here is what most people don't realize. Large financial institutions, the kind that custody hundreds of billions in client assets, are not permitted to move into a new asset class based on enthusiasm. They are bound by fiduciary duty, by capital requirements, by internal risk committees, and by external auditors who will personally lose their licenses if they sign off on an allocation that lacks proper regulatory cover. For those institutions, the question has never been, do we believe in this asset? The question has always been, are we legally permitted to hold it, custody it, and offer it to our clients without taking on uncompensated regulatory risk? Until very recently, the honest answer for XRP in the United States was no. Or more precisely, not yet, not cleanly, not at scale. That answer changed this quarter. And it changed in a way that most retail commentary has completely failed to register. When the OCC issues a conditional national trust charter to a digital asset firm, that firm moves from operating alongside the regulated banking system to operating inside it. When the FDIC begins formal rulemaking on stablecoin issuance by bank subsidiaries, the legal pathway for tokenized dollars to flow through insured institutions opens for the first time in American banking history. When the SEC convenes a formal policy roundtable on public blockchain integration, and the director uses language about avoiding a financial panopticon while preserving institutional privacy, that is not casual rhetoric. That is the regulator telling the market which design principles will survive the rulemaking and which will not. This is the system that retail does not see, and it is the system that determines when and how the repricing actually happens. Now let's do the math, because the math is where the story stops being interpretive and starts being structural. Cross-border payments, The global cross-border payments market moves roughly $190 trillion in value every year across corporate, institutional, and retail rails. The Forex market clears around $7.5 trillion per day. The derivatives market, when you include notional exposure, sits north of $1 quadrillion. These are not estimates pulled from a forum post. These are figures published by the Bank for International Settlements and confirmed across central bank disclosures. Now hold those numbers in your mind and look at the supply side. XRP has a fixed total supply of 100 billion tokens. There is no inflation schedule. There is no validator reward expanding the float. Of that 100 billion, a meaningful percentage is locked in escrow with monthly releases that are predominantly returned to escrow. A percentage is held in long-term institutional positions that do not circulate, and a further percentage has been verifiably lost or rendered inaccessible since the network launched in 2012. The truly liquid float, the supply that is actually available to absorb new institutional demand, is a fraction of the headline circulating number. Here is the math that the retail crowd ignores. If a single percentage point of annual cross-border payment volume routes through a bridge asset, that's $1.9 trillion in settlement throughput per year. To clear that volume against a liquid float measured in low tens of billions of tokens, you do not need a prediction, you need a calculator. The bridge asset model does not require sustained holding. It requires sustained velocity. But velocity at scale, against a fixed and shrinking liquid supply, has only one expression in price terms. The token must reprice upward until each unit can carry more value per transfer, because the alternative is a settlement layer that constantly runs out of inventory at the moments it is most needed. That is not a Moonboy fantasy. It is a design requirement for the system to function at the scale its architects have publicly stated they are building toward. And now, layer the second mechanism on top. Every wrapped XRP token deployed across the new Layer 2 ecosystems must be backed one-to-one by native XRP held as collateral. As DeFi liquidity pools on Optimism, Base, and the other named networks expand, the locked native XRP backing those wrappers grows correspondingly. That XRP cannot circulate while it is serving as collateral. It is, for all practical purposes, removed from the tradable float for as long as the wrapped position exists. Run that mechanism in parallel with ETF inflows, which absorb spot XRP from open market exchanges and move it into regulated custody, where it does not return to the order book for arbitrage purposes. Run it in parallel with institutional treasury allocations, which once executed move into multi-sig cold storage where the average holding period is measured in years, not weeks. 3 independent supply contracting mechanisms. 1 fixed total supply, a demand curve being pulled upward by regulatory clarity and institutional permission. This isn't a prediction. It is the logical mathematical outcome of inputs that are already in motion. While the retail conversation is consumed with price action and sentiment, the institutional signal has never been more specific or more named. Bank of America's research division published analysis this quarter stating in explicit language that U.S. banks are entering a multi-year on-chain transition. That phrasing matters. A bank of that size does not publish that kind of forward guidance unless its own balance sheet is positioned to participate in the transition it is describing. The analysts named the OCC, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve as the 3 agencies actively constructing the regulatory perimeter for stablecoins and tokenized deposits. They named Ripple specifically among the firms that received conditional national trust charters. They projected the operational framework for regulated stablecoin issuance to be finalized by mid-2026 and fully effective by early 2027. Larry Fink at BlackRock has been on record for over a year describing the tokenization of financial assets as the next generation of markets, with a target addressable opportunity that he has publicly framed in the trillions. Jerome Powell, in successive Federal Reserve communications, has acknowledged the role of stablecoins in the dollar's continued reserve status. The IMF has begun formal working groups on cross-border digital settlement that reference the specific architecture XRP was designed to provide. Ask yourself this brutal question. Does a trillion-dollar firm like BlackRock move toward tokenization without absolute legal certainty about the regulatory environment those tokenized assets will operate in? Does a regulator like the OCC issue a federal trust charter to a digital asset firm without first satisfying itself that the firm's underlying technology and asset architecture can survive sustained institutional scrutiny? Does the Federal Reserve coordinate with the FDIC and the OCC on a unified stablecoin framework without a clear internal view of which settlement layers will carry that flow? These institutions do not gamble. They position. And the positioning that is happening right now, across regulatory agencies, across the largest asset managers in the world, and across the banking sector itself, is not the positioning of entities preparing for the technology to fade. It is the positioning of entities preparing for it to become structural. Contrast that with the retail conversation. Retail is debating whether the chart looks bullish on a 4-hour time frame. Institutions are signing NDAs, executing custody agreements, filing for fund approvals, and quietly accumulating positions through OTC desks where the trades never appear on the public order book. Two completely different games are being played on the same board, and only one set of players actually understands the rules. Let me name the catalysts on the calendar, because this is where the analysis stops being abstract and starts being operational. FDIC stablecoin rulemaking. Detailed proposed rules covering payment stablecoin issuance by FDIC-supervised bank subsidiaries are in active rulemaking right now. The comment periods and finalization windows place the operational framework firmly inside the next 12 months. Once those rules are in place, every FDIC member bank in the United States has a defined legal pathway to participate in stablecoin issuance and settlement. That participation requires settlement infrastructure. That settlement infrastructure already exists. Genius Act implementation. The stablecoin legislation signed into law has a finalization window pointing toward mid-2026 and an effective date approaching early 2027. That is roughly an 8-month window from where we sit today, before the legal framework for regulated stablecoins is not just on paper, but operationally binding on every bank, every issuer, and every settlement provider in the United States. OCC Trust Charter Conversions. The conditional national trust charters issued this quarter have defined pathways from conditional to full status. Each conversion expands the scope of regulated activity the chartered firm can offer. Each expansion brings additional institutional flows into the regulated digital asset ecosystem. Spot ETF flow data. The XRP Spot ETF complex has been registering consecutive sessions of net positive inflows for an extended period now, with cumulative AUM growth that is no longer marginal. Each session of net inflows pulls additional spot from open market exchanges into regulated custody. The supply effect compounds. RLUSD multi-chain deployment. With native issuance now active across multiple major Layer 2 networks, the locked native XRP collateral requirement grows in direct proportion to DeFi liquidity expansion on those networks. The mechanism is automatic, mathematical, and continuous. When you place these catalysts on a single timeline, the convergence becomes visible. The regulatory framework completes in the same window that institutional product availability expands, in the same window that supply contracting mechanisms accelerate, in the same window that the public blockchain integration policy from the SEC moves from roundtable to rulemaking. That is not a coincidence. That is a designed convergence, and it is now operating on a publicly visible schedule. Here is what I want you to internalize. We are moving from an era of abundance to an era of scarcity, and the transition is happening faster than the headlines suggest. Exchange reserves of XRP are at levels that on-chain analysts have not seen in years. Every spot ETF session of net inflow pulls additional supply into regulated custody, where it does not return to the order book to be sold for a quick profit. Every RLUSD deployment on a new Layer 2 network locks additional native XRP as collateral. Every institutional treasury allocation moves additional tokens into multi-sig storage where the holding period is structural, not tactical. Once a token enters a regulated institutional vault, it does not come back to market because the price moved 10%. It is held for the strategic purpose the institution acquired it for, and that purpose is measured in years. The institutional desks have spent the last several years engineering the conditions under which they could accumulate aggressively without alerting the broader market. Sustained price suppression, recurring narrative cycles of fear and doubt, public commentary designed to convince retail that the thesis was dead, that adoption was stalled, that regulatory clarity would never arrive. Every one of those cycles served the same function. It provided exit liquidity from impatient holders to patient ones. That phase is now ending. Not because the institutions decided to be charitable. Because the regulatory framework has progressed far enough that the next phase of the accumulation game cannot be played at suppressed prices indefinitely. Once the Genius Act rules take effect, once the FDIC stablecoin framework is operational, once the OCC trust charters complete their conditional periods, the regulatory risk premium that has held this asset suppressed simply evaporates. There is no mechanism left to keep it down, and when that risk premium evaporates, the price does not rise gradually. It gaps, because the entire population of institutional capital that has been waiting for legal clarity moves from the sidelines into the market within a compressed window. The wait-and-see capital becomes all-in capital, and the wait-and-see capital is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars across the institutional landscape globally. The door is closing fast. Not metaphorically. Operationally. The conditions that have allowed accumulation at current prices have a remaining shelf life that can be measured in months, not years. I know it's difficult. I know that watching the chart move sideways while the institutional headlines accumulate creates a particular kind of cognitive dissonance. You read about a major bank publishing multi-year transition analysis. You read about a federal trust charter being granted. You read about Layer 2 deployments and ETF inflows. And then you look at the price and you wonder why the market does not seem to care. Let me reframe what you are actually watching, because the dissonance dissolves once the mechanism is visible. The price action of the past several months is not a reflection of weakness in the underlying thesis. It is a reflection of the final phase of accumulation by entities that need the price to stay where it is for as long as possible while they complete their positions. The headlines accumulate. The custody agreements get signed. The OTC desks clear their inventory. And the public chart shows a quiet, sideways drift that convinces the impatient to sell to the patient. Being early feels exactly like being wrong, right up until the moment that reality catches up. And reality, in this case, is being catalyzed by a regulatory and institutional convergence that is now on a defined operational timeline. The question is not whether the price will recover. The question is who will still be holding when the prices on the screen today are looked back on as the floor, and who will be sitting in the comment sections of the late videos explaining why they sold for a small loss right before the structural repricing began. The masses are focused on the noise of the daily candle. The smart money is focused on the structure that the candle has not yet acknowledged. You get to choose which one you are. I want to come back to one thing from the SEC roundtable that I think most coverage has underweighted because it has direct implications for the long-term thesis. The director's specific framing around zero-knowledge proofs, selective disclosure, and the avoidance of a financial panopticon is not abstract policy theater. It is a signal about which technical architectures the regulator considers viable for institutional adoption at scale. Public blockchains that cannot provide compliance with privacy preservation will not receive the institutional flows that the largest financial institutions need to participate. Market makers cannot operate when their inventory is permanently exposed in real time. Underwriters cannot function when client flows are visible to the entire market. Corporate treasuries cannot allocate when every payment is publicly traceable to a wallet that adversaries can map. The settlement layers that survive this regulatory cycle will be the ones that can demonstrate compliance without surrendering operational privacy. That is a non-trivial technical bar, and the architectures that clear it will be the architectures that institutional capital actually flows through. The XRP ledger's design philosophy, its transaction architecture, and the development pathway around features that support compliant privacy are directly relevant to this regulatory direction. This is not a coincidence. This is the result of an architectural roadmap that anticipated the regulatory direction years before the regulator publicly articulated it. When you see a public regulator describing the precise design principles that a specific settlement architecture has been pursuing for nearly a decade, that is not noise. That is alignment. And alignment of that kind tends to translate into preferential institutional positioning over time. One additional element that deserves attention. The conversation in the United States, important as it is not the only conversation that matters. The Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and several Gulf central banks have all moved publicly toward digital settlement frameworks that contemplate public blockchain integration. Japan's FSA has been progressive on digital asset frameworks for years and has named tokenization as a strategic priority for the domestic financial sector. The EU's MiCA framework provides a unified regulatory environment across 27 member states. The Monetary Authority of Singapore has been active in cross-border CBDC and tokenization pilots. The UAE has positioned itself explicitly as a regulated hub for digital asset infrastructure. When you map the regulatory progression across these jurisdictions and overlay it with the corridors where on-demand liquidity volume has been growing fastest, the geographic distribution of institutional adoption becomes visible. This is not a US-only story. It is a global story in which the US is, in some respects, catching up to frameworks that have been operational in other jurisdictions for some time. For an asset whose primary use case is cross-border settlement, the convergence of regulatory frameworks across multiple major jurisdictions in compressed time windows is precisely the condition under which adoption transitions from gradual to non-linear. Let me bring this together. 3 institutional events landed inside a 72-hour window this quarter. The SEC convened a formal policy roundtable that explicitly named zero-knowledge proofs and selective disclosure as the design principles for institutional public blockchain participation. Bank of America published analysis describing a multi-year on-chain transition for the U.S. banking sector and named Ripple among the firms now positioned inside the regulated banking system through a conditional national trust charter. The FDIC moved into active rulemaking on stablecoin issuance for bank subsidiaries. Layer on top of that, the RLUSD native deployment across major Layer 2 networks, the ongoing ETF inflow data, the Genius Act implementation timeline pointing into a 2026 finalization and 2027 effective date, and the global regulatory convergence happening in parallel across Japan, the EU, Singapore, and the Gulf. These are not unrelated headlines. They are pieces of a convergence pattern that has been under construction for years and that is now visibly approaching its operational window. Price is the distraction. Structure is the reality. One is a candle. The other is a system being assembled in public view by the largest financial institutions on the planet. The question is not whether you believe the thesis. The question is whether you are watching the noise or whether you are watching the architecture. Because the architecture is nearly complete, the operational catalysts are on a defined timeline, and the supply contracting mechanisms are running in parallel against a fixed total supply that does not grow. History does not reward comfort. It rewards those who pay attention when the room is quiet. If you made it to the end of this analysis, drop the word convergence in the comments. I want to see who actually tracked the full picture. If this kind of structural breakdown is useful to you, the like button helps it reach others who need to see it, and subscribing means you'll be here for the next piece of the pattern when it lands. Stay patient, stay rational, stay positioned. The math doesn't lie, and the system is almost complete.